Thank you all for being here on an hour of 5 o'clock at the busy end of the semester. We appreciate your presence with us. This book, Prophetic Witness, exists in response to the hopes really of hundreds of Catholic women who over the past many years have participated in Boston College's programs addressing the concerns of Catholic women in the Church. In particular, this collection is an outgrowth of two memorable conferences held at Boston College. The first, Envisioning the Church Women Want, which took place in the spring of 2004. It was sponsored by the Church in the 21st Century Initiative and led by Boston College's Tuesday Morning Women, a university-wide group of interested faculty, administrators, and students who came together weekly for coffee, community, conversation about women's issues. The follow-up, second conference event, Creating the Church Women Want, was held in the summer of 2006, sponsored by Boston College's Institute of Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry, in celebration of its 35th anniversary. It was preceded by a week-long evening course that was titled Prophetic Witness. Those who were gathered enjoyed the conversation, the camaraderie, and found themselves drawn to new levels of commitment, dialogue, and goodwill. Following the first conference, women participants noted that posing a more just and inclusive vision of church for the 21st century was a fine first step, but it would never be enough to bolster the necessary journey of reform and renewal. They sought practical strategies that held the possibility of inspiring the ecclesial lives of Catholic women now. These women expressed a strong desire for imaginative proposals that could stimulate creative fidelity in challenging ecclesial times. This book is offered in response to their request. It brings together the voices of leading Catholic women theologians from across the U.S., presenting particular strategies for reform and renewal of the Church. The result? An anthology that we believe is strikingly different, direct, practical. And the contributing authors hope that readers will find here significant resources that stimulate more expansive ways of thinking and effective forms of praxis. As editor of this book, I want to express, right at the offset, my gratitude to Patricia DeLu and James Keenan, the general editors of the C21 book series, for their outstanding leadership and their commitment to Catholic women's concerns. I have to thank them, too, for their willingness to run with this proposal that I made to them for a book written by women, especially for women, focused on strategies for renewal and reform. For the exceptional support shown for this book project and attention to all the logistics pertaining to today, I thank the Church in the 21st Century Office, John McGinty and Karen Kiefer in particular. And mostly I thank the folks who are gathered on this stage tonight, because without them we wouldn't have this wonderful event. And this is the way to do a women's collection, to allow you to have access to some of those voices who are leading us tonight. And I'm going to introduce them first and then ask each one of them to present a 5 to 7 minute synopsis of the strategy they recommend in their essay. So I'd like to introduce and welcome first Dr. Sean Copeland. Dr. M. Sean Copeland is Associate Professor of Systematic Theology in the Department of Theology with a joint appointment in the program in African and African Diaspora Studies at BC. Adjunct Associate Professor of Systematic Theology, II, at the Institute for Black Catholic Studies, Xavier University in New Orleans. Dr. Copeland holds the PhD in Systematic Theology from Boston College. She's the co-editor, along with Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, of 2 volumes on feminist theology. She's the author of more than 85 book chapters, journal articles, and reviews on such topics as the meaning of the human person, social suffering, political theology, and Black Catholic theology and life. She's the author of the upcoming, soon-to-be-released Paulus Press publication, The Subversive Power of Love, and also Uncommon Faithfulness, The Experience of Black Catholics, to be published by Orbis this May. Dr. Copeland is a former president of the Catholic Theological Society of America. We welcome her. Francine Cardman is Associate Professor of Historical Theology and Church History at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. She's been on the Weston Jesuit faculty since 1979 and holds the PhD in Historical Theology from Yale University. Her work focuses on questions of history, theology, and practice, particularly in regard to Christian antiquity and contemporary issues. Her teaching and research interests include the history and theology of early Christianity, early Christian ethics, the history of Christian spirituality, feminist theology, and ecumenism. Thanks for being here, Francine. Dr. Jane Regan is a member of the theology faculty at Boston College's STM, teaching in the Institute for Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry department. Her academic background includes a PhD in religious education from the Catholic University of America, and this is very much complemented by her pastoral work in key leadership positions. She's been involved in the area of religious education for almost 30 years now, at parish and diocesan levels, and most recently as consultant to parishes working to enhance adult faith formation. She is the author of the book Toward an Adult Church, A Vision of Faith Formation, and the co-author of the book Good News in New Forms, a companion to the General Directory for Catechesis. Thank you, Jane Regan, for being here. Nancy Pineda-Madrid is Assistant Professor of Theology and U.S. Latino Ministry at Boston College's School of Theology and Ministry. She holds a PhD in Systematic and Philosophical Theology from the Graduate Theological Union. Her research and writing interests focus on the problematic intersection of suffering and the quest for salvation from a Latina feminist perspective. She is Catholic by birth and by choice, and a feminist by provocation, instigation, and irritation. Thank you, Nancy Pineda-Madrid. Okay. I'm sorry, did I miss somebody?
Yes.
I did. Forgive me. Mary. I had a reverse order there. I'm so sorry. Mary Margaret Doyle Roach, in blue here, is Assistant Professor and Edward Bennett Williams Fellow at the College of the Holy Cross, where she teaches courses in Christian ethics. Her research interests include ethical issues involving children and families, feminist ethics, and Catholic social teaching. She is co-editor of Calling for Justice Throughout the World, Catholic Women Theologians on the HIV/AIDS Pandemic, which is being released by Continuum this year. Welcome to you, Mary Doyle Roach. I should add that she has degrees from Weston, Jesuit Theological, and BC. Her PhD is from BC. So she's a local, for sure. Susan Abraham is Assistant Professor of Women's Studies and Ministry at Harvard Divinity School. She's the author of Identity, Ethics, and Nonviolence in Postcolonial Theory, a Rahnerian Theological Assessment, published in 2007. And she's just finished a book project, a co-edited anthology of Catholic feminist reflections on the traditional theological loci of theological anthropology, Christology, and ecclesiology. Her current research interests are in the area of feminist theory and theology, theology and culture, and global Christianity between colonialism and post-colonialism. Thanks for being here, Susan. Okay, I've just been told that Pat DeLu has just come in, and we mentioned you earlier, Pat. We want to thank you again for making this project possible. Pat DeLu. All right, so we begin now with our first strategy and strategist. Renewing the vision. Without a vision, the people perish. reads Proverbs 29, verse 18. Amid challenging ecclesial times, having a vision becomes more necessary than ever. Sean Copeland, in her essay, Knit Together by the Spirit as Church, articulates for us insights that are communally wrought and not simply for women alone.
Thank you very much, Colleen, and it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. This essay, which is the second in the first part on renewing the vision, really takes an inspiration from Pentecost. This becomes, in a real way for me, the paradigm of ecclesia, or the paradigm of church, that I wish to hold up in the essay, even if I am not referring to it explicitly or exclusively. The point I would want to make is that the Spirit, then, is a Spirit who opens, refreshes, undoes, and overturns what can be destructive of human persons. The Spirit also represents a thrust for freedom. And in this instance, what I try to use, freedom where? Freedom in the culture. So the strategies that I'm proposing, if I think of these in terms of strategies, are really openness and self-criticism. Openness to the Spirit through attention to culture. And why? Well, there's the old remembrance that grace always builds on nature. And what is human in human life, Orlando Espín reminds us, is what is cultural. So I'm very much interested then in the working out of our response to the Spirit, who enables us to confess Jesus as Lord in the context of culture. My concrete example there is the experience, or recounting the experience, of Dona Fortunata Manusco. This is a character in the film The Golden Door, in which Italian immigrants experience the hegemony of Anglo-Saxon meanings, of Anglo-Saxon values. And this woman, with great dignity and great firmness, resists the diminution of her person, the assault against her dignity, her integrity, and her culture. This seems to me to be an excellent paradigm for thinking about openness, creativity, and thinking about resistance. Well, resistance to what? Resistance to what divides us, resistance to what injures us, resistance to what abuses God's love in us. I try to conclude the essay by returning to what I think is an image of Pentecost, but wrought out of our own American experience. The church in the early days of its existence here was polyglot, pluricultural, and very diverse. It remains that way today. In fact, we might even say even more so. So for all of us, it is a challenge to be open to the Spirit, who opens us to the confession of Christ, who opens us to one another. It's incumbent upon all of us to practice some forms of self-criticism so that we're aware of the biases, and I don't mean predilections, but I mean it in the sense of the more or less conscious refusals to open ourselves to difference, to open ourselves to the other, to regard the other, to shoulder the burden of the other, to hold the other in love and in esteem. I'm speaking really about the practice of solidarity under the Spirit, and that practice that's fundamental to a church that is a church in the 21st century.
Our second strategy, knowledge as power. Knowledge that carries practical intent is inherently powerful. It's also demanding. Knowledge of this sort refuses to be just informative. It seeks to influence people's heads and hearts, and to invite personal and communal transformation. Francine Cardman, in her essay, Sisters of Thecla, Knowledge, Power, and Change in the Church, asks us to really take another look at early historical Christianity and to see it as a liberating resource.
Thank you.
In this essay, I try to do a number of different things, some of which Colleen has commented on, and some other things that she hasn't. I try to look both, yes, at early Christian women's history or a piece of it as a resource. I try to look at the ways in which knowledge of our past can be powerful, but also the ways in which knowledge of our past can be disempowered and covered over and needs to be rediscovered. But I also try to look at the dynamics briefly of the power that disempowers that knowledge, and that makes memories not just dangerous but endangered. And then try to do what I always try to do, which is to say, what can we learn from that, the so what question? What can we learn from that about today, and about, as John was saying in his introduction, not simply reading the signs of the times, but trying to discern their meanings and what they call us to do. And I do that through women's stories, and in particular, two kinds of stories. One, the story of Thecla in the early church, who may or may not have been herself one single historical woman, but represents in a symbolic way the ministries of many women in the earliest centuries of the church, in the first and into the second century. Thecla, who wanted to follow Paul, and Paul, who really didn't want her following him, and who found her own path to ministry through God's call and empowerment. And then, secondly, the stories of women today who find themselves called to ministry and specifically to ordination. And in this essay, I look at one woman in particular who had been a student at Weston Jesuit School of Theology in Cambridge, who told me a number of years ago now that she was one of the women ordained in the Roman Catholic women priest movement on the St. Lawrence Seaway a few years ago. And she sort of like blew the scales off my eyes, both about herself and about what this movement was really about. And they become kind of symbolic markers for me of the past and of the future. These Thecla and all the women she stands for, Jean Marchand and all the women she stands with and for. And I'm not talking about women's ordination as itself the only strategy or the only issue here, but I'm using it to uncover a lot of other issues and a lot of other strategies. So I can't go through anybody's story here, really, except just to sort of tell you, I hope in a way that would convince you to read the essay, some of the things that I try to do there. One, first, is to complicate the idea of knowledge as power. Knowledge is and can be power, but knowledge, as I said, can also be powerless and disempowered. And power can make knowledge that may or may not be true knowledge. And so the complication of knowledge and power is and understanding it, seeing it and understanding it, unmasking it for what it is itself a strategy. Coming to look at questions of power and disempowerment, of knowledge and of empowered knowledge and of subjugated knowledges, and why they got subjugated and what happens when they rise again, is the first strategy really that I'm proposing. And so all I want to do about the story of Thecla is simply to say, if you remember this story at all, Thecla is remembered as a virgin and martyr. Thecla, as far as we can tell, was a virgin. She was never a martyr. And she's not remembered for the more dangerous things, or she's remembered in a way that's disempowered. The Orthodox call her is apostolae, equal to the apostles, but nobody acts on the meaning of what that memory, what that title might mean. Why don't we remember her as preacher and teacher? Why don't we remember her the way she was used in the early church, as a symbolic authorization for women's ministries, whether they were well received or badly received, and they were both in different times and in different places. I also, moving from Thecla's story to the present, look at what I think you could call a second strategy about reading the signs of the times, using this idea of Foucault's about knowledge and power, using the story of Thecla in mind, looking at what's happened since the 1970s in the Roman Catholic Church and the women's ordination movements that have risen and subsided and risen again. But also looking at the context, if you want, and the timing of authoritative statements about women's ministries, about ordination, about the relationship of lay ecclesial ministries and the ministries of all the faithful to the ministries of priests and so on. And I just want to point out two things. There's a cluster of things happened in the mid-70s. One is the Philadelphia ordination of the Episcopal women priests in 1974. The second is 1 year later, the Women's Ordination Conference in Detroit. And bingo, 1 year later, we get a document from the Vatican about women's ordination, the so-called Vatican Declaration from 1976. Or the next cluster of documents, when do they appear? In 1992, women's ordination in the Anglican Communion was extended to South Africa, England, Australia. In 1994, we got a statement on the ordination of priests, Ordinatio Sacerdotalis. In 1995, we got the document from the Curia in response to the question from John Paul II about, well, is what I said an authoritative statement of the ordinary magisterium that is to be believed by all? Is it part of the deposit of faith? It's not accidental that these things happen when they happen. And there may be knowledge at work here, but there is also power at work here, and it's power that is shaping and spinning knowledge. And it's also power that is confining other knowledges that don't fit its structure. So a second strategy I'm proposing is then a faithfully resistant reading of the tradition that's cognizant of these dynamics of power and knowledge and sensitive to the presence of subjugated knowledges. The third part of this essay is looking at the sort of resurgence, rebirth of the women's ordination movement in the Roman Catholic Church, which had sort of subsided for a while. And then all of a sudden in the first few years of this new millennium and this new century started to reappear. And I argue that both the movement of women into lay ecclesial ministry, whether these are women who feel themselves called to ordination or not, but definitely called to ministry, their reception in ministry, and their welcome by the people with whom they minister already constitutes, in a way, a kind of recognition of their call by the church. Not by necessarily the institutional formal structures, but by the structures of the church where it lives on the ground in the people, in and among the people. And then I look briefly at the this most recent Roman Catholic women priests movement, and see in there the outcome of the first strategies, looking at the sort of resistant reading and looking back at Thecla and looking at where that's carrying us today. And I name one strategy, but I think there's a second one that goes with it in relation to this part that I didn't name explicitly there. That one is a strategy of following the call. If you're called, and if you can, follow it. In this case, about women's ordination, about being ordained. In other cases, about being called to ministry. Following the call is a strategy for change. It's not always easy, and it's not always welcome, but it's essential. And then secondly, a second or correlative strategy is that we begin to take seriously the experience of these women who feel called to priesthood and whose call is affirmed by people around them, those with whom they minister, that we make them the subject of careful, critical, prayerful, and theological reflection, that we ask about where the Spirit may be leading us through them, that in doing that, as a professor at a school of theology and ministry, I make a choice not to let myself be silenced by being afraid of being marginalized, by a kind of marginalization by association, but to say this is crucially important to recognize what's happening here. And also, so not allowing myself, not allowing ourselves to be marginalized, and not allowing not just Thecla, but these women today not to be disappeared, but to be, in fact, the subjects both of their own lives and of our own reflection. And then finally, the last point of this strategy is to ask ourselves, what would it mean for us to welcome them back into the church as ordained Roman Catholic priests? So.
Our third strategy represented here tonight is paying attention to the politics of the hearth. Many concerns about the church are raised by women that impinge upon our home lives, our families, our raising of children. Jane Regan, in her essay, Fostering the Next Generation of Faithful Women, raises insights about passing on the faith to daughters.
Great to be here and wonderful to see you. When my oldest daughter, who's now 20, when she was 4 and just home from Russia where I had adopted her, one of the first places we went, of course, was to the grocery store to get some food. And the gumball machines, those really colorful gumball machines, really caught her attention. She goes running over there thinking, this looks great. And I went over and kind of put my hand on her shoulder and bent down to her and said, oh, you know what, Natalia? Regans don't take gum from gum machines. And her English was minimal, and she nodded and walked away. Well, we repeated that several times over the next several visits to the grocery store, so that eventually she didn't even notice the gumball machines. She just walked right by them. I don't think she even noticed them. But I knew that she had taken on that identity when her younger sister arrived from Russia, who at the time was 2.5. And again, one of the first things a now family of 3 does is go to the grocery store. And she takes Katie over to the gumball machine, leans down next to her with her arm on her shoulder and says, Regans don't take gum from gumball machines. Now, I've thought at the time, and I've thought often after that if only it was so easy to pass on what I truly believe and what we truly believe. If only we could put it in simple propositions of what we do and don't do. And while we can't do that, I believe that in many ways, and that's what my essay reflects on, is that fostering the next generation of faithful women involves very much doing many of the same things I did with my daughter and with my second daughter in that setting. So as a believer, as a woman of faith, as a religious educator, and as a single parent of 2 now late-teen daughters, the question of the next generation of faithful women is an important one for me. So I want to make one comment and then talk about 3 strategies. My first comment is this. The term faithful, as in like the faithful, has kind of gotten a bad rap, eh? It's kind of been dismissed as kind of childish or childlike belief, as quiet obedience, as loyalty too easily given. But that's not what I mean when I talk about the next generation of faithful women. Rather, when I look at the process of faith development, I see fundamentally that it's a shift from being faithful to my parents' beliefs, faithful to my group, faithful to the church's belief, okay? From faithful to towards being faithful in, okay? Here's what I mean. It seems to me when we talk about women and being faithful, they're being faithful in the process of being and becoming church. These faithful women neither give their fidelity naively nor their loyalty easily. Rather, these faithful women, the term that you use, that faithful resistance, those faithful women are steadfast in their commitment to the always challenging, often uncertain, and at times confrontational process of being and becoming church. So I'm speaking here of faithful women as faithful in the process. And I believe that in being faithful in that process, we are in fact being faithful to ourselves and to the call that we've received. This is the heart of my understanding of what faithful is. So let me talk about 3 strategies. Okay. The first strategy I want to talk about is how important it is that we name for our daughters, and obviously this applies to sons and to others who are not our immediate daughters, etc., that we name what we really believe, name our passions. That is, name what gives meaning to our lives, what gives sustenance to our lives. Because it's there, it's in what we are passionate about that we find the meaning to our lives. When Katie had first come, my younger daughter, when she first came from Russia, she didn't speak hardly at all and was kind of working at both of them, saying please and thank you, at dinner, that kind of thing. And one day we're in the car, and Kate's on her way to dropping Kate off at preschool. She's probably about 3, had been there about 6 months, and really had not said a word, hadn't said anything yet. Not a worry now, hadn't said anything at the time. And so we're in the car, we're driving along, and I was living in Minnesota at the time, and so Minnesota nice, with one person goes and the next person goes. This is driving, merging. It's lovely, really, very nice.
Not Boston.
No, not Boston. And so the car ahead of me, which should have gone behind me, kind of decided it was going to be he go, and it was close enough that I actually had to, tap the brake to keep from hitting him. And from the back seat, with a clarity and an attitude that was right on, I heard, "Jerk!" I'd been working on please and thank you for a month. But jerk, she knew where my passion rested, right? She got it. She got where my energy was invested. And so it seems to me that as faithful women looking to form the next generation of faithful women and men looking to form the next generation, that naming, not simply in our actions, but in our words as well, where our commitments are. I certainly, you may be committed to a sustainable living, and you may express that in all kinds of actions within your home and how decisions are made around that. Put it into words. Remember when my daughters first came, we'd say grace before meals, and we would do this lovely, long, involved grace, praying for everybody. And it dawned on me that they would never know the bless us, the Lord, and these are gifts, which we all can say in like a split second. They would never know that unless I said it with them. So, yeah, I have to do that as well. I have to be sure that, in fact, those things that are part of what I believe is to be passed on, I use and speak about. Second strategy, conveying what gives us hope. It's important to engage in conversation about the reason for our hope or what gives us hope. It seems to me that it's in conversation that we come to recognize and realize more fully what we believe. It's really in conversation that we come to recognize the reality of pluralism in our communities, in our world, in our families. That the only way we can do that is by engaging in that kind of dialogue. So that the way in which I speak about my faith, again, not just live it, but speak about my faith, is key to raising faithful daughters. My older daughter, who's now a young adult, has arrived at young adulthood with a fairly dark view of herself and of the world around her. Now, it's a fairly dark place that she lives. My role is not to convince her that it's not a dark place, but to live and speak from the light that I have, from the hope that I have. That's how, in fact, she can glimpse and glimmer the lights that's there, is in my speaking clearly, not denying her experience, but affirming my own light. Speak about the hope. And finally, the third one is to acknowledge areas of challenge in being and becoming faithful women. And to tell you that I'm borrowing right from what we've been talking about already, to say there's a challenge to being part of the church and to being and becoming church. There's a challenge to living out our beliefs within a consumerist, militarist, human-centric world. It's there. And unless, again, we can acknowledge it, if we can speak about it, then the hopes that our daughters will see the challenge and live into it are there. After John Paul II died, we were sitting around the dinner table talking about, what that meant, etc. And my daughter turned to me and said, "So who are you voting for?" I don't think I have a vote in this one. She was shocked. I was just shocked at the idea that I didn't have a vote or even a voice in what was going to happen next. So it seems to me that we need to recognize the challenge of what it means to live as faithful people, but not give in to allow the darkness to overcome the light that's there. And I believe that's at the heart of what it means to live in the both-and world of the Catholic theology. It's to recognize the challenges, but not to allow them to be overwhelmed by it. And so we end up with, as we name our passions, convey our hopes, acknowledge the challenges, we end up with hope. Hope for ourselves and hope for the future. Thanks.
We'll continue along with politics of the hearth. The public positions of Catholic communities carry significant implications in private life, something infrequently acknowledged. Underscoring the symbiosis between the public and the private, Mary Doyle Roach urges us to think about our children and the common good.
Thank you. The Church in the 21st century has its founding rooted in response to the sex abuse crisis within the Church, in which vulnerable children were at the center. The move to protect children was urgent and long overdue. Like most issues of sexual justice, the abuse crisis was more about power than it was about sex. And attention, with some justification, turned quickly to the exercise of authority within the Church. Lay members of the Church demanded to be treated like adults and not like children. For adult members of the Church, that may be appropriate, but in the context, the claim was unfortunate in that it kept being treated like a child as really a pejorative statement, right? It betrayed what I think is an as yet unresolved question for the Church about how we really think about who children are and what childhood is about, and it may explain how the spotlight on children moved very quickly away from them in the context of that crisis. The piece that I contributed to the volume, along with several others in the Politics of the Hearth section, seeks first to bring children back to the center of our moral concern. Children who share intrinsic human dignity, are full, interdependent members of the many overlapping communities of which they are a part, and whose particular vulnerabilities create real obligations on the parts of adults. But second, I wanted to make the argument that in addition to protection from people and institutions that undermine their well-being, children also need to participate meaningfully in our common life. So my politics may begin at the hearth, but it moves out to the community and attempts to attend to the situation of poor children in particular. So the strategies that I envision are really more for institutions, including our churches, than they are for parents raising children in their own families. One of the things I think that it's important for us to do first is to really examine our habits and attitudes toward children and childhood. Seen and not heard. Or unseen entirely, as we routinely separate children for their education, their recreation, and even often for their liturgical worship. They will go to a separate place for a separate homily, which in some ways is a sign that we're interested, right, in communicating with children. But it means that our normal way of speaking in the church will not speak to them. So they're set aside. Or the children's and family liturgies where everybody with children who are under the age of 7 goes, and so it's like Bedlam. And then when you bring your children under the age of 7 to one of the other liturgies, you know that there are people who are saying, don't they know there's a 9 o'clock Mass where they could be somewhere else? So to really look at some of our practices and how they are or may not be fully inclusive of children. And also to keep an eye out for what might be token forms of involvement for children in our communities, which really might aim to satisfy the emotional needs of adults. And you know, when I think about this, there's a scripture scholar who notes that Christmas pageants may be kind of notorious in this regard. We write the scene, they play it out, we ooh and we ah, and it's all very charming. But we can also think of other ways that children, particularly children of privilege, participate in our communities, or when they are visible, at music and dance recitals, at sporting events, all of which now have an increasingly competitive atmosphere, and at which many adults have trouble behaving. We need to think, too, about how thinking about children as really the icing on the cake, right? They are a sign of vibrancy in our families, our communities, and our churches. But if they're the icing on the cake, that betrays a sense that all that the ingredients that are nutrient, all the things that really go into the stuff of the cake come from adults, and that children simply make the picture look pretty. And I think we should think very carefully about that. And lastly, in our self-examination, to think about our commitment to family values, which is very popular in political rhetoric today. But how often does that commitment prompt us to think about what kind of obligations it creates among us for other people's children? So the cornerstone of my recommendations in the chapter is really a commitment to being a voice for children, all children, and children's human rights, understood in light of the tradition of the common good and the option for the poor. And that we should raise this voice with as much vigor as we raise our voices in promoting the right to life itself. One area in which the churches might consider some practical strategies is in our commitment to primary and secondary education, an avenue by which the church's gifts have long met the needs of often marginalized children. The piece that I wrote highlights the Cristo Rey network of schools, which many of you might be familiar, but in which at Cristo Rey the students' participation is vital to the school's survival and its success. Students do not merely draw benefits from attending. They help, through their work, build up the goods that are shared by all. other institutions can lend their considerable competence and power to support these kinds of initiatives. And here I mean Catholic institutions of higher education, healthcare, and social services. And I think on these, and actually on the next point, in the time that these essays have been percolating, Boston College has really taken a leadership in this area, particularly in terms of access or increasing access to Catholic education, with, I think, very careful attention to where schools are being opened and where they are being closed. And we must look at this with an option for the poor, and Dean O'Keefe of the Lynch School has certainly been vigorous in this. A more equitable distribution of the burdens of providing such access to education, so that parishes who house schools do not face the challenges that presents alone. Also, an education to resist the gated community phenomenon in our schools, that rising tuition costs, practices of admission and exclusion often protect some children, even gain their advantage in the community at the expense of others. And finally, support for an outstanding public school system for every child. And here we would need to scrutinize very carefully programs that draw funds from some schools, even if that might represent improved enrollment or financial outlook for Catholic schools. The Church's efforts to protect children are urgent, but they will come up short unless we take children's dignity as moral and social agents seriously, broaden our notion of the contexts that undermine their well-being, and the role that we all play in creating that context, and unless we welcome children's participation in our common life. Thank you.
Our next strategy is attending to emerging discourses, particularly those found on the margins. Coming into more inclusive ways of thinking and loving and being community demands keeping a close ear to the ground. The potential for greater expansiveness of thought and action depends on careful discernment of and response to the movement of God's Spirit in specific historical, cultural milieus in which we find ourselves. There are questions with which our communities of faith need to grapple with as they are being formulated, and often they're being formulated by voices that have been pushed to the margins. Nancy Pineda Madrid, drawing from her long experience in leadership in Latina communities, invites us to consider discourse around popular Catholic religiosity.
Thanks, Colleen. When Colleen asked me to contribute to this volume, I found myself reflecting once again on what enables me to continue to choose Catholicism. I am a Catholic not only by birth, but by choice. What sustains me in it? And then not only what sustains me, but what cultivates my hope. My hope for a church more inclusive of the gifts of people of color, the gifts of gays and lesbians, the gifts of women. Every year when I teach U.S. Latino theology, we spend a couple of weeks covering the history of the U.S. Latino Catholic experience. As I go over this material each year, I find myself struck by the historical tenacity of so many Latinos to remain Catholic. Popular religious practices sustain me and offer, I believe, all kinds of possibilities for sustenance, and one strategy for the necessary transformation of the Church. Popular religious practices can be shaped and reshaped. Accordingly, they offer a range of potent possibilities. They bear the possibility of transforming our understanding of church. What exactly am I talking about? I intend practices like the building of altars in the home, like theodramas of Guadalupe and Jesus' death and resurrection, and the posadas, like the ritual of carrying in your wallet or calendar the image of a particular saint, and many, many other similar rituals. A few points of further clarification. Popular religious practices should not be confused with devotional practices promoted by the institutional church. These are two distinct realities. Popular religious practices find their origins not in the clergy or in the church's institutional leadership, but they find their origin in the people. In fact, that's why they're called popular. They're popular because they are of the people. Through popular religious practices, Latinos have found a way to sustain Catholic faith in the midst of a church that is too often hostile. They are the people's interpretation of their faith. These practices are not contrary or opposed to official church teachings and practices, but these practices live alongside them. They are a strategy for taking ownership of the faith and making the faith your own. They represent what I call a borderlands hermeneutic. I grew up on the U.S.-Mexican border in El Paso, Texas, immediately across from Juarez, Chihuahua. And for those of you who've traveled there, you know that at night you can't distinguish the cities at all because they really are one urban community. I know firsthand the gift of being a borderlands person and of having a borderlands perspective. I speak English, Spanish, and Spanglish, and all are needed in El Paso. Popular religious practices represent a borderlands hermeneutic, in that they are certainly Catholic and affirming of the gospel message of life, but they also reside at a distance from the center. They exist in the borderlands of Catholicism, just as El Paso, Texas is pretty far removed from Washington, D.C., not only physically, but also metaphorically. Being in the Catholic borderlands allows popular religious practices a space for creativity, for imagination, and thus for transformation. There are a number of us who find ourselves in the Catholic borderlands. For us, the elasticity of popular religious practices provides an opportunity for prophetic witness. Thank you.
And our final strategy, and remember you're only hearing 6 of 23 tonight. Insistence on dialogue. There's no substitute for honest dialogue in community, and there are far too few opportunities for it in present Catholic ecclesial life. Really, it is the pearl of great price, and a most effective strategy for change in the church. One can never fully predict the outcome of dialogue in terms of the collective intelligence to which it will give rise. One can expect it to be a source of empowerment, however, a shared exploration of previously held thoughts and feelings that helps to transcend limiting perspectives and assumptions. Susan Abraham invites us into dialogue with practical theology in global contexts.
Thank you, Colleen, and thank you for having me. My essay began as the result of a rather acrimonious dialogue between a number of women, a very, very heterogeneous group, in which there were Wiccans, atheists, very, very strong Roman Catholics, all stripes of other Christianities, and some people who plainly said they didn't know what they were. We had just read, it's a women's book club in Western New York, where I was at the time, and we had just read Elaine Pagels' book, Beyond Belief. And of course, as was our wont, and this happened with every book that we read, the Wiccan, who's very animated, and the atheist, who's very opinionated, started a very acrimonious conversation about the whole problem with Christianity is that our beliefs are outdated. Now, there were two theologians, or as I like to call myself, aspiring theologians in the group. So we tried to push the theoretical question, which is belief necessary for the knowledge of God? Which is a rather theological academic question. Only, people at 5 o'clock in the afternoon who are theologians will come around to discuss such a thing and think it's interesting, right? But people were caught by the question. And I think that is very important, that we really had a productive conversation because of that question. Is belief necessary for the knowledge of God? And what was interesting to me was not the answer to the question. What was interesting to me is the cultural context in which that question has meaning. So if you look at a Wiccan's answer, the answer is, I don't know. I don't know, but I think yes. If you're going to think about God and a divine being, you must believe in this divine being. An atheist said, I don't care. The Catholic said, of course it's necessary. Some of the other, other than Catholic folks, the Christian folks around there said, beliefs are absolutely critical. In other words, this community spanned the spectrum of ideas about what constitutes religious behavior. But for me, as somewhat of an outsider, it was very interesting to see that as a slice of American or United States' very unique regional form of grasping with what religious behavior is. So if you look at the Wiccan, between the Wiccan and the atheist, there's a very interesting problem going on. They are doing something to theological categories. Forgive me, my head is very theoretical. They're grappling with two theological categories, the category of immanence and the category of transcendence. The atheist actually radicalizes transcendence, but so much so that it's gibberish in her head. The Wiccan radicalizes immanence, and therefore everything in the concrete world becomes, as she translates it, full or infused with one kind of divine expression. So that was what I was caught by. But of course we push the question, is belief necessary for the knowledge of God? If the answer is yes, here's the problem. If the answer is yes, on the one hand, is belief necessary for knowledge and faith in God? That was the question. If the answer is yes, we actually compromise the possibility of revelation or divine activity. Can God never approach us and reveal God's self to us? Do we have to believe before we have revelation? So there's that problem. Faith in God. If belief is necessary for faith, what is the possibility of thinking of Augustine? What is the possibility of conversion? Think about Augustine here. So, of course, this is the way my mind thinks, and then everybody got plenty irritated with the way the conversation was going, and they said, well, that's it. We're not discussing the book anymore. We're discussing Susan's agenda, as usual. But I started, the essay came out of that conversation, what happened in this group. And it came out of, I would say, a very practical question. Is theology, the way we do it, the way we read it, the way we write it, the way we teach it, is that relevant at all to people's real lives? One of the practices that I'm very interested in is the practice of hospitality. And one of the better writings that I've noted on it is by a Protestant theologian, Miroslav Volf, who teaches at Yale. Now, here's one claim that he makes, which I find very interesting. If you're going to practice Christian hospitality, you need to have it grounded in Christian belief. Therefore, if you're going to be hospitable, it has to be because you are utilizing the incarnational principle. Now, nobody can disagree with any of that. He goes on, because theologians these days don't write just for their little tribe. Theologians these days, if theology has got to do anything with real life, is talking to a far wider audience. What is the possibility of real hospitality, which is his definition would be Christian hospitality? What is the possibility of real hospitality by someone who's not a Christian? And his argument is, well, they really do not have a Christian practice. They have a Christomorphic practice. Now, for me, my standpoint, if you will, I'm really not very much into all of this identity conversation. I mean, I rarely claim my Indian identity. I have no idea what that means. Speaking for 1 billion people, it's a little bit difficult. But in that context, it would be very difficult for me to say that there are absolutely no examples of real hospitality coming from other religious traditions. I have to be able to translate Wolf to that community. And I would say that we need to push Wolf to ask the question, but how much of a Christomorphic practice, because, a Hindu or a Muslim cannot do the real thing, it's Christomorphic, how much of that requires belief? And if you look at somebody who twists this whole conversation, somebody like a Gandhi, for example, whose very stance is one of hospitality, even to the colonizer. He refused to treat the colonizer as a thing, even when he himself had been. That would be real hospitality in my book. What does he do with Christian belief? He actually challenges it and says, my problem is that you Christians don't quite get it. I, as a Hindu, I get it. And therefore, I can actually practice real Christianity, which you fail to do, and you may be believing whatever. I don't have to believe all that, but I can actually practice it. Now that becomes a prophetic space for those of us who are interested in practical theology to ask the question, what exactly is the relationship between belief and practice? Two other things, I'm also a feminist. I mean, we've been confessing over here all kinds of identity markers. I would say I'm a complicated Catholic. After that comes a feminist. And as a feminist, I read all sorts of feminisms. And one of the ones that I think is very interesting recently is Tina Beatty's book, New Catholic Feminism, in which she proposes retrieving the maternal metaphor as a strategy for making the argument for women's ordination. And that's a great metaphor. And I think it really can serve to make the church, the institutional church, a more hospitable place for women. My problem with it is that it's limited to that context. How would I, who Colleen described my stance maybe as one on the margins, I must confess I don't like the margin very much. It's no fun being there all the time. And it determines you. You're supposed to be one way. You're supposed to act one way. I don't like all that. How can I engage with the maternal metaphor when I am no mother, I cannot be I will not be a mother, etc., etc.? What are the limits of that metaphor? And that's when I pick up a post-colonial theorist, somebody who's extremely, extremely difficult to read, so don't go there. If you don't want to, don't really. Her name is Spivak. She teaches at Columbia University. But she has these pithy phrases, and you can take 3 words out of her whole book and really explains everything. One of her phrases that I really like very much is called, well, she calls it this, uterine social arrangement. The problem, she says, is women are always described from within this framework. We are organized by our uteruses. In other words, we are organized biologically. We are determined biologically. And Spivak says, those of us who are not mothers in the biological sense really cannot just stay with that biological experience. We have to question, for example, how motherhood is implicated in global economic systems. Everybody rushing to buy cars, the cosmetic industry, the billions of dollars that goes into the reproductive logic that undergirds the cosmetic industry, sports gear, in order to solidify masculine identity and feminine identity. All of these things become very problematic. And in the global context, you can only do theory from those perspectives. Whatever metaphor you retrieve, you're going to have to look at its embeddedness in these economic, political, cultural, and social systems. But Spivak doesn't dismiss everything about human beings. In there is a person who actually cares about human beings. And I remember saying this when I was delivering this paper at a public event. I had a dissertation because of one sentence in one of Spivak's books. It's one of her famous books. It's called A Critique of Post-Colonial Reason. And on page 384, it was very important to me, there was this idea that the only thing that is left for us to think about after all this is said and done is how to love. And she defines love. It is a one-on-one, ethical, intimate connection. And that's a tall order. I had never heard of post-colonial theorists talking about love. She doesn't go back to it because she doesn't spell it out. She's not aware of the entire Christian background or heritage of that word, which was why I had a dissertation, because of that one sentence. But she says we must do this in love. Now, what more of a Christological rationale would one need for doing theology in the post-colonial context? Shall we base it in love? Was my question. That's why I wrote that essay. Thank you.
Thank you. And a big round of applause to our 6 local theologians from the book, all of whom joined us. We thank you for your decision to believe in and act out of hope for a future church now, because that decision is never made for yourselves alone. It's really a stance taken that inspires many of us in the present and becomes a lead for those to follow us.